"Kill me, but spare my daughter," begged the woman. Cowboy took them both away. The woman's voice broke the silence like a gunshot. "Kill me," she begged, her fingers digging into the dry earth. "Please, just kill me. But let her live." The cowboy stood 3 feet from her, his revolver pointed at the ground, his shadow long across the dirt. Behind him, the sun hung low and red, painting everything the color of dried blood. The woman knelt in front of him, her dress torn at the shoulder, her dark hair falling loose around her face. She clutched her daughter's small hand so tight the child's knuckles had gone white. The little girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just stared up at him with eyes that looked too old for her face, eyes that had already seen what no child should ever see. Behind them, barely 10 feet away, lay the body of a man, the woman's husband. His blood had soaked into the sand, turning it dark and heavy. His hat rested a few inches from his outstretched hand, like he'd been reaching for it when the bullet found him. The man's eyes were still open, staring at nothing, his mouth frozen in the shape of a word he'd never finish saying. The cowboy had heard the shots from half a mile out. He'd been riding through the canyon when the sound echoed off the rock walls, 3 cracks, close together, followed by silence. He'd spurred his horse toward the noise, not because he was brave, but because something in him still remembered what it meant to care. When he'd crested the ridge, he'd seen them, a small wagon overturned, its contents spilled across the ground. A woman and a child huddled together. A man lying still in the dirt, and dust rising in the distance. The dust of riders moving fast, heading away, but not far enough yet. The outlaws had left them alive. For now. The cowboy knew what that meant. Men like that didn't leave women breathing out of kindness. They left them breathing because they planned to come back. Because a woman alone in the desert was easier to track than a woman on the run. Because they wanted her to feel the fear first, to know what was coming, to understand that death would be a mercy by the time they returned. The woman knew it too. He could see it in her eyes. Not just fear, but certainty. She'd already calculated her chances, already understood that she had none. "Please," she said again, her voice breaking. "I'm begging you. Don't let them take me. Don't let them." She stopped, her throat closing around the words. She pulled her daughter closer, pressing the girl's face against her chest. "Just promise me you'll take her somewhere safe. Promise me she won't have to see." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He looked at the woman, then at the child, then at the body of the man who tried to protect them and failed. He thought about turning around, about climbing back on his horse and riding away, about leaving them here, because getting involved meant trouble, and trouble was something he'd spent 7 years trying to outrun. But then the little girl lifted her head. She looked right at him, and for a moment the world stopped. Her face was the same shape, the same small nose, the same dark eyes that seemed to hold more sadness than any child should carry. She looked exactly like his daughter had looked, the daughter he'd buried on a hillside outside Abilene 7 years ago, next to the woman he'd loved more than his own life. He'd been working a ranch 2 days right away when the fever came. By the time he got home, they were both gone. His wife had died first, and his daughter had followed her 2 days later, calling for him in her sleep while strangers held her hand because he wasn't there. He'd left that town the morning after the burial. He'd ridden west and never looked back, because looking back only showed him the things he couldn't fix. But now, standing in this desert with the sun bleeding red across the sky, he saw her again. Saw his daughter's face in this stranger's child. Saw the same silent plea, the same desperate hope that someone, anyone, would choose to care. The cowboy lowered his gun all the way. He holstered it slowly, his hand steady even though something in his chest was breaking open. "Get up," he said. The woman stared at him, confused. "What?" "Get up," he repeated. His voice was rough, worn down by years of silence. "Both of you." "I don't understand. Those riders are coming back," he said, cutting her off. "They're probably watering their horses right now, laughing about what they're going to do when they return. We've got maybe an hour, maybe less." The woman's eyes widened. "You're not going to..." "No," he said. I'm not. He turned toward his horse, a sturdy buckskin mare that had carried him across 3 territories without complaint. She stood calm and patient, her reins loose, watching him with dark, intelligent eyes. The cowboy untied his bedroll and pulled out a canteen. He walked back to the woman and held it out. "Drink," he said. "Then get your daughter on the horse." The woman took the canteen with shaking hands. She unscrewed the cap and held it to her daughter's lips first, waiting until the girl swallowed before taking a sip herself. The whole time, she kept looking at him like she couldn't believe he was real. "Why?" she whispered. The cowboy didn't answer. He walked over to the dead man and knelt beside him. He closed the man's eyes with 2 fingers, then took off his own hat and held it over his chest for a moment, a gesture of respect for a stranger who tried to protect his family and paid for it with his life. Then he stood, walked back to the woman, and offered her his hand. She hesitated. Her daughter watched him with those 2 old eyes, still silent, still holding her mother's hand like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "I'm not asking you to trust me," the cowboy said quietly. "I'm asking you to choose. You can stay here and wait for them to come back, or you can get on that horse and ride." The woman looked at her daughter. Then she looked at her husband's body, lying still in the dirt. Her face crumpled for just a moment, a flash of grief so raw it hurt to see, but then she pulled herself together, the way women in the West had learned to do. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, took a long breath, and reached out. The cowboy pulled her to her feet. He lifted the little girl first, settling her in front of the saddle. Then he helped the mother up behind her, making sure she had a good grip. The horse shifted under the extra weight, but didn't protest. The cowboy swung up behind them both, his arms on either side of the woman as he took the reins. It was close, too close, but there was no other way. 3 people on a horse built for one. It would slow them down, but it was better than leaving them behind. "Hold on," he said. He kicked the horse into motion, and they rode. Behind them, the body lay cooling in the dirt. The overturned wagon sat broken and empty. The desert wind picked up, erasing their tracks 1 grain of sand at a time, as if they'd never been there at all. The woman didn't look back. She held her daughter tight and kept her eyes forward, toward the horizon, toward whatever came next. The cowboy didn't look back either. He just rode, the weight of 2 lives pressed against him, the ghost of a third riding silent at his side. In the distance, dust began to rise again. The girl hadn't spoken in 11 days. Not a word, not a sound, not even a whimper when the desert sun burned her skin or when thorns from the brush caught her dress. She sat in front of her mother on the horse, her small body rigid, her eyes fixed on the horizon like she was watching for something that would never come. The cowboy had started counting the days on the 4th morning, when he realized the silence wasn't temporary. It wasn't shock that would wear off after a night's rest or a warm meal. It was something deeper, something that had burrowed into the child's chest and locked itself there, refusing to let go. He'd seen it before. During the war, he'd watched men stop talking after battles that broke something inside them. They'd sit around campfires with their mouths closed, their eyes empty, their hands shaking when they thought no one was looking. Some of them came back eventually. Others never did. But this was different. This was a child. They rode through country that didn't forgive mistakes. Canyon walls rose red and cracked on either side of them, carved by water that hadn't flowed in years. The sun hammered down during the day, turning the air thick and heavy, and at night the temperature dropped so fast the cowboy could see his breath in the moonlight. He kept them moving, slow but steady. The horse couldn't carry 3 people at full speed, so he picked a pace she could manage, walking mostly, with short stretches of trotting when the ground was flat and the animal seemed strong enough. The woman never complained. She held her daughter with both arms wrapped tight around the girl's waist, her chin resting on top of the child's head. Sometimes the cowboy heard her whispering, soft words he couldn't make out, a steady stream of comfort that went unanswered. Other times she sang quiet lullabies that drifted forward on the wind, songs about mockingbirds and diamond rings, and dreams that came true if you wished hard enough. The girl never responded. She just sat there, stiff and silent, her hands folded in her lap. On the fifth day, they crossed a dried riverbed, where water had once run deep enough to carve smooth stones. The cowboy dismounted and searched until he found a few that still held moisture underneath, tucked in the shadows where the sun couldn't reach. He filled the canteen and brought it back to the woman. She took it gratefully, her lips cracked from days without enough water. She drank, then held the canteen to her daughter's mouth. "Please, sweetheart," she whispered. "Just a little." The girl drank, but she didn't look at her mother, didn't acknowledge the hand that held the canteen or the voice that begged her to stay present. She swallowed the water like it was medicine, something necessary but joyless, and then returned her gaze to the empty distance ahead. The woman's face crumpled, just for a moment. Then she pulled herself together the way she always did, pressing a kiss to her daughter's hair and whispering, "It's okay. It's okay, my love. Take your time." The cowboy looked away. He busied himself checking the horse's hooves, running his hands along her legs to make sure she wasn't going lame. But he'd seen the mother's expression. He'd seen the grief there, sharp and fresh as an open wound. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He was getting them to safety, that was all. Once they reached the next town, he'd leave them with someone who could help. A church, maybe. Or a kind family willing to take in a widow and her child. His job was to deliver them alive. Nothing more. But at night, when they made camp in whatever shelter they could find, a cluster of rocks, an overhang, the remains of an old prospector's cabin, he found himself watching them. The woman would lay out the single blanket he'd given them and settle her daughter on it, curling around the girl like a shield against the world. She'd stroke the child's hair and hum those lullabies, her voice soft and breaking in places, until finally the girl's eyes would close and her breathing would even out into sleep. And even then, the woman wouldn't stop. She'd keep humming, keep holding her daughter, tears sliding down her face in the darkness, her whole body shaking with the effort of staying quiet so the child wouldn't wake. The cowboy would sit across from them, his back against stone, his rifle across his knees. He'd watch the way the firelight caught the woman's tears, the way her hand never stopped moving through her daughter's hair, the way she held on like letting go would mean losing the last thing in the world that mattered. He remembered doing the same thing 7 years ago when his own daughter had been sick with fever. He'd held her through the night, whispering promises he couldn't keep, telling her stories about places they'd go and things they'd see when she got better. He'd felt her small body burning against his chest, felt her breath coming shallow and fast, and he'd known, somewhere deep in his gut, that she was slipping away from him. But he'd held on anyway, because what else could he do? His daughter had died just before dawn. His wife had followed her 2 days later, the grief taking her faster than the fever ever could. And he'd buried them both on a hillside under a cottonwood tree, marking their graves with stones he'd carried from the river. Then he left, because staying meant looking at those stones every day, because staying meant admitting he'd failed the 2 people who'd needed him most. He'd been running ever since. On the 8th day, they passed through a small settlement, barely more than a trading post and a few scattered cabins. The cowboy bought supplies with the last of his money, dried meat, flour, coffee, a small bag of peppermint sticks. He told himself was practical, because sugar could keep a person going when nothing else would. The woman stayed on the horse with her daughter, her face hidden beneath the brim of a hat he'd given her to keep the sun off. People stared, but no one asked questions. In the West, a man traveling with a woman and child was common enough. Widow and her new husband, most would assume. Or a rancher moving his family to fresh land. Let them think what they wanted. The cowboy didn't explain, and the woman didn't speak. But when he came back with the supplies and handed the peppermint sticks to the girl, something changed. The child looked at the candy. Then she looked at him. Really looked at him, for the first time since he'd pulled them onto his horse 11 days ago. Her eyes were dark and deep, full of a pain that made his chest ache. She didn't smile, didn't say thank you, but she took the peppermint stick, unwrapped it slowly, and put it in her mouth. The woman's breath caught. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears spilled over before she could stop them. "Thank you," she whispered to the cowboy. "Thank you." He nodded once, then turned away, his throat tight. That night, they camped in the shelter of a rock formation that looked like a hand reaching up from the earth. The woman sang her lullabies, and the girl fell asleep with the taste of peppermint still on her tongue. The cowboy sat across the fire, watching them. He thought about the town that was still 3 days ahead, about the moment when he'd hand them over to someone else and ride away, about how easy it should be to leave behind people he barely knew. But when he closed his eyes, he saw his daughter's face. And when he opened them again, he saw this child, this silent, grieving girl who'd lost everything and still somehow kept breathing. He didn't know when it had happened. But somewhere between the first day and this one, these strangers had stopped being strangers. And that terrified him more than any gang of outlaws ever could. The door slammed in the woman's face before she could finish her sentence. She stood on the porch of the boarding house, her daughter's hand in hers, her mouth still open around the word please. Through the window, the cowboy could see the landlady's shape moving away, her skirt swishing with finality, her decision already made. It was the fourth door that morning, the fourth rejection. The town was called Redemption, though the cowboy couldn't imagine what it had ever redeemed. It sat in a valley between two ridges of red rock, a collection of sun-bleached buildings arranged along a single dirt road. There was a general store, a church, a saloon, a smithy, and a handful of houses that looked like they'd been built by people who'd run out of hope halfway through and finished the job anyway. They'd arrived at dawn, the horse exhausted, all three of them covered in dust and silence. The cowboy had helped the woman and her daughter down in front of the church, figuring that was the best place to start. Churches were supposed to help people. That's what they were for. But the preacher had taken one look at them, at the woman's torn dress, at the child's hollow eyes, at the cowboy's travel-worn face, and shaken his head. "We don't have the resources," he'd said, his voice apologetic but firm. "Winter's coming. We barely have enough for our own families." The woman had nodded, thanking him anyway, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. They'd tried the boarding house next. Then the general store, where the owner's wife had suggested they try the next town over. 30 miles east, she'd said, as if 30 miles was nothing to a woman on foot with a child who wouldn't speak. Now they stood outside the seamstress's shop, the last place the cowboy could think of. The woman had straightened her dress, smoothed her daughter's hair, and knocked with a hope that was already dying in her eyes. The seamstress had opened the door, listened for exactly 10 seconds, and said, "I can't help you." "I can sew," the woman had said quickly. "I can mend, I can wash, I can cook. I don't need much, just a corner somewhere, just enough to." I said, "I can't help you." The seamstress's voice had been harder this time. "I've got 3 girls of my own to feed. I can't take on a widow and her child." "I'm sorry." She wasn't sorry. The cowboy could hear it in her voice. She was uncomfortable, maybe, annoyed at having to say no, but not sorry. The door closed. The woman stood there for a long moment, her hand still raised like she might knock again. Then she lowered it slowly and turned away. The cowboy saw her face as she walked past him, saw the shame there, red and raw across her cheeks, saw the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. She gathered her daughter close, pressing the girl's face against her skirt, and walked toward the edge of town with her head down. He followed at a distance, his jaw tight. This was what he'd brought them to. This town that called itself Redemption, but didn't know the meaning of the word. This place where people locked their doors against strangers and called it wisdom. He'd told himself all the way here that someone would help them, that there were good people in the world who took in widows and orphans because it was the right thing to do. But he'd been lying to himself, and he knew it now. The woman stopped at the edge of town, where the road gave way to open desert again. She sank down onto a wooden crate someone had left in the dirt, her daughter standing beside her, and put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She just sat there, her shoulders curved inward, her whole body folded around the weight of rejection. The cowboy stood 10 feet away, his hands in his pockets, his chest tight with something that felt like anger but burned hotter than that. He'd been poor before. He'd known hunger, known what it felt like to need help and find none. But he'd been a man alone. He'd been able to work, to ride, to fight if he had to. This woman had nothing. No husband, no money, no home. Just a child who wouldn't speak, and a world that didn't care. "I'm sorry," the woman said quietly, not looking up. I thought it would be different." "It's not your fault," the cowboy said. "I know." Her voice broke on the words. "But it doesn't matter whose fault it is, does it? We're still here. We still have nowhere to go." The little girl leaned against her mother's knee, her face turned away from the town, toward the desert that stretched endless and empty beyond them. The cowboy opened his mouth to say something, he didn't know what, but before he could speak, footsteps approached from behind. "Well, well," a voice said. "What have we here?" The cowboy turned. 3 men stood there, their faces flushed with drink even though it wasn't yet noon. They'd come from a saloon. The cowboy could smell the whiskey on them from 6 feet away. 2 of them were young, barely old enough to grow proper beards. The third was older, with a gut that hung over his belt and eyes that moved over the woman like she was something he could buy. "Pretty thing," the older man said, grinning. "You offering services, sweetheart?" "Because I got a few coins in my pocket and an itch that needs scratching." The woman's face went pale. She stood quickly, pulling her daughter behind her. "We're not interested," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "Now, don't be like that." The man stepped closer. "A widow's got to make a living, somehow. And you look like you could use the money." The cowboy moved before he could think. 3 steps, and he was between the man and the woman, his hand on the man's chest, pushing him back. "She said no," the cowboy said quietly. The man's grin faded. "This ain't your business, stranger." "I'm making it my business." "That right." The man's hand dropped to the gun at his hip. "You want to die for some woman you don't even know." The cowboy's eyes didn't leave the man's face. "Try me and find out." For a moment, no one moved. The 2 younger men shifted nervously, their hands hovering near their weapons, but not quite touching them. The older man's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. Then the cowboy spoke again, his voice low and cold. "You say one more word about her, one more word, and I'll put you in the dirt. That's not a threat. That's a promise." The man stared at him. Then he spat in the dust and took a step back. "She ain't worth it anyway," he muttered. He jerked his head at his companions. "Come on. Let's get out of this sun." They walked away, but the older man looked back once, his eyes full of the kind of hate that didn't forget. The cowboy watched until they disappeared into the saloon. Then he turned back to the woman. She was staring at him, her face a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that looked like grief. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. "Now they'll remember you. They'll come looking for you. Let them. You don't understand. You've made yourself a target. For us. For people you don't even. I know exactly what I've done." The cowboy's voice was quiet but firm. He looked at her, then at her daughter, then back at her. "And I'm not leaving you here." The woman's breath caught. "What?" "I said I'm not leaving you here." He picked up the reins of his horse, who'd been standing patient in the shade of a building. "This town doesn't want you. Fine. We'll find somewhere that does." "But you said you were just taking us to safety. You said," "I know what I said." He met her eyes. "I was wrong." The woman's face crumpled. Tears spilled over, and this time she didn't try to stop them. She covered her mouth with her hand, her whole body shaking with the effort of not sobbing out loud. The little girl looked up at her mother. Then she looked at the cowboy. And for the first time in 14 days, something changed in her expression. Something small and fragile, but real. The cowboy helped them both back onto the horse. The woman didn't ask where they were going. Maybe she knew he didn't have an answer. Maybe it didn't matter. As they rode out of Redemption, the town that had turned its back on them, the cowboy made a decision he knew he couldn't unmake. He wasn't just protecting them anymore. He was keeping them. And somewhere deep in his chest, in the place where his heart had been silent for 7 years, something painful and terrifying began to wake. The cowboy's hand shook as he pushed open the cabin door. 7 years of dust fell from the frame, catching the afternoon light like snow. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. The table with 2 chairs, the iron stove in the corner, the wooden cradle near the window that he'd built with his own hands for a daughter who'd never grow old enough to remember it. He stood in the doorway, unable to move. His throat closed. His chest felt like something was crushing it from the inside. The woman came up behind him, her daughter's hand in hers. She looked past him into the cabin, then at his face, and understood without him having to say a word. "This was yours," she said quietly. Not a question. A knowing. The cowboy nodded once. His jaw was so tight he thought his teeth might crack. The woman waited. She didn't push past him, didn't ask questions. She just stood there with her daughter, patient and still, giving him the space to decide whether he could actually walk through that door. Finally, he moved. 1 step, then another. The floorboards creaked under his weight, the same sound they'd made 7 years ago when he'd walked out and never looked back. The woman followed him inside. She set her daughter down gently, then walked to the window and opened it, letting fresh air push through the staleness. Dust swirled and settled. Light cut across the floor in golden bars. "It's a good cabin," the woman said. She ran her hand along the table, then looked at the stove. Solid, built by someone who cared. The cowboy couldn't speak. He watched her move through the space, this space that had belonged to his wife, where she'd cooked meals and sung while she worked and laughed at jokes only the 2 of them understood. Watching this stranger touch the same surfaces felt wrong and right at the same time, like reopening a wound that had never properly healed. The little girl walked to the cradle. She stood in front of it, staring down at the small wooden bed, and then she reached out one hand and touched it. Her fingers traced the carved flowers on the side, roses, because his wife had loved roses even though nothing like them grew within 100 miles. The cowboy turned away. He walked outside, his breath coming hard and fast, and stood in the yard with his hands on his knees until the world stopped spinning. When he came back inside, the woman had found a broom. She was sweeping, working methodically from one corner to the next, pushing years of neglect toward the door. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of cloth torn from her hem. Her daughter sat at the table, watching her mother work with those same silent, ancient eyes. "You don't have to," the cowboy started. "I know," the woman said. She kept sweeping. "But I want to." That night, she cooked the first meal that cabin had seen in 7 years. Just beans and cornbread from the supplies he'd bought, but it filled the space with warmth and the smell of something living. They ate in silence, the 3 of them around that table. And when they finished, the woman washed the dishes using water the cowboy had pulled from the well. The well his wife had loved because it was deep and cold and never ran dry, even in the worst summers. He gave them the bedroom. He didn't tell them it had been his and his wife's. He just said they'd be more comfortable there, and the woman had accepted without argument. She'd taken her daughter's hand and walked through the doorway, closing it softly behind them. The cowboy slept outside that first night. He couldn't bring himself to sleep inside those walls. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But in the morning, when he woke to the sound of the door opening and saw the woman step out onto the porch with her daughter, something in his chest loosened just slightly. The days that followed fell into a rhythm he hadn't expected. He fixed a fence that had fallen down, hammering posts back into the hard ground. He chopped wood from the dead trees nearby, splitting logs until his shoulders burned and sweat ran down his back. He cleared the brush from around the cabin, making space so they could see anyone coming from a distance. The woman worked inside. She scrubbed the floors, washed the curtains his wife had sewn, aired out the quilts that had been folded away in a trunk. She found seeds in a jar, pumpkin seeds his wife had saved from their last harvest, and planted them in the small garden plot behind the cabin, even though it was late in the season and they might not grow. The little girl followed her everywhere, silent but present. On the 3rd day, the cowboy brought home 3 chickens from a rancher 5 miles away. He'd traded work for them, half a day of mending fence in exchange for the birds and a bag of feed. He built a small coop out of scrap wood and wire. When it was finished, he showed the little girl how to scatter feed, how to collect eggs without scaring the hens. She watched him carefully. Then she took the feed from his hand and scattered it herself. Still silent, but participating. On the 5th day, as the woman was hanging laundry on a line the cowboy had strung between 2 posts, the little girl began to hum. It was so quiet at first that the cowboy wasn't sure he'd heard it. He was repairing the porch steps, his hammer raised, when the sound reached him. A soft, broken melody, not quite a song, just a few notes repeated. He froze. The hammer hung in the air, forgotten. The woman had frozen too. She stood with a wet shirt in her hands, her eyes wide, her mouth open in shock and hope. The little girl sat on the porch steps, her small hands folded in her lap. She hummed, stopped, hummed again. Like she was testing whether her voice still worked. Like she was remembering how to be a child. The woman dropped the shirt. She walked slowly to her daughter and knelt beside her, not touching, not speaking, just being close. Tears ran down her face, but she was smiling. Actually smiling. The cowboy set down his hammer and sat on the bottom step. The 3 of them stayed like that, the woman kneeling, the girl humming, the cowboy listening, as the sun moved across the sky and shadows grew long across the yard. That night, after the girl had fallen asleep in the bedroom, the woman and the cowboy sat on the porch together. It was the first time they'd been alone, really alone, since that day in the desert. "Thank you," the woman said quietly. "For this. For all of it." "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." She looked at him in the darkness. "You gave us more than shelter. You gave us a chance to heal." The cowboy stared out at the night, at the land that had once been his, that he'd abandoned because it hurt too much to stay, at the cabin behind them, warm with lamplight and the presence of people who were alive. "I didn't think I'd ever come back here," he said. "But you did." "Yeah." His voice was rough. "I did." The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your wife and daughter, they'd be glad that the cabin isn't empty anymore." The cowboy's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that his family wouldn't want strangers in their home. But he couldn't say it because he knew, deep in the part of him that still remembered who he used to be, that she was right. His wife had been kind. His daughter had loved helping people. They wouldn't have wanted this place to stay frozen in grief forever. "I don't know how long we can stay," the woman said softly. "I don't want to be a burden. When spring comes, maybe I can find work somewhere, maybe." "Stay," the cowboy said. The word came out before he could stop it. The woman looked at him, surprised. "Stay," he said again. "Quieter this time. Both of you. As long as you need." She studied his face in the darkness. "Are you sure?" He wasn't sure of anything. He didn't know what he was doing or why. He just knew that the thought of them leaving, of this cabin going silent again, of riding away and never knowing if they were safe, made something in him hurt worse than staying ever could. "I'm sure," he said. The woman nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. They sat together in the quiet, listening to the night sounds, crickets, a distant coyote, the wind moving through the grass. Inside, through the window, they could see the little girl sleeping in the bedroom, curled up small beneath a quilt the cowboy's wife had made with her own hands. The cowboy looked at that window, at the light, at the life that had returned to a place he'd thought was dead forever. He still didn't know if he was doing the right thing. Still didn't know if he deserved this second chance at being someone who protected instead of abandoned. But for the first time in 7 years, he felt something other than emptiness. And maybe he thought that was enough.